We're continuing on now in our series, Stepping Out in Faith, and what an apropos series for what we are going through now in our city, on our island, in our own families, and across the world. What does it mean to trust God, to move from the known to the unknown like Abraham did? Abram left the place that he was raised. He left the security of his surroundings. He left his family, his inheritance, the things that he could control, the things that seemed normal for him. Those things got taken away for Abraham. And it feels like those things are getting taken away for us as well, doesn't it? The things that we find to be most comfortable, our patterns of life, even just getting to be together to worship on Sunday, those things are being pulled away. And we define faith, according to Hebrews 11:8, as stepping from the known to the unknown. That Abraham, he woke up, and when he left by faith, he trusted God as he walked and sojourned into a land that he did not know. He went from the known to the unknown. And for you and I as well, we get to take that same step, day by day by day. But it starts to get uncomfortable when you're in the unknown, doesn't it? It doesn't take too long for you to step out to the place where you are comfortable and to feel like things are falling all around you. And it's in moments like that when we have to bring ourselves back, to reorient ourselves about what truly matters, who God truly is, and how we can truly trust Him in the midst of whatever we're going through. You know, my family and I, we've been tracking, obviously, the things on the news, and I'm a news junkie, and I'm following feeds on my phone, and I'm looking on CNN that evening, watching whatever updates or whatever World Health Organization tweet to give us an update about what's going on in Italy or here in the United States. And as I'm following these things, it's just filling my mind, and we were talking about it, and then finally one night this past week at the dinner table, we said, that's it. Tonight, we're just going to sit at the table, and we're just going to be with each other. We're going to stop talking about the chaos and enjoy what we have over this meal. You know, there's something powerful about slowing down around the table and enjoying fellowship. And then after that, we made another decision. No more watching the news tonight. There's nothing we could do. We have washed our hands. We have socially distanced ourselves from as many people as we can possibly do. There's nothing else to do. Tonight, we're putting on a funny movie. And my wife and my two boys and I, we sat down and we just belly laughed watching a movie. There's something about laughter as well. There's something about being with those you love across the table and finding some unity. And there's something welcoming and warming about laughter in times of fear and uncertainty and chaos. And in our text this morning from Genesis 18, we see those same two themes pop up in this text. In Genesis 18, we see Abraham and Sarah. These are their names now. Abram now becomes Abraham, the father of nations. And Sarah, this princess, will as well be a leader for many people. We see Abraham and Sarah in chapter 18 around these two themes of a table and around this idea and image of laughter. And God uses this table image and metaphor to demonstrate in the life of Abram what it means for the person of faith to commune with God in the midst of waiting for His promises. And for you and I as well, we'll see this morning that we are invited to commune with God in the same way. And then for Sarah, we'll see in the text, that laughter for her actually exposed her heart and her disbelief in God. But that in the end, God uses that same laughter in her life to demonstrate the faith and growth and trust in God that Sarah exhibited over time as well. And so this morning, community with God and enjoying laughter at His provision is where we'll see this text leading us to. And my prayer is this morning that as we do so, we will be encouraged no matter what uncertainty, No matter what promise seems to be delayed, no matter what blessing we still have not yet seen come to fruition, God invites us to sit with him and to laugh. Turn with me in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 18 once again, and we'll see in verses 1 through 8 this first movement of the text, a meal of peace, sitting around the table, and how in the midst of this, God meets Abraham where he is. This is the word of God. The Lord appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamre. As you remember before, God has been working in the life of Abraham at this place. And while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent during the heat of the day, he looked up and he saw 3 men standing near him. And when he saw him, he ran from the entrance of the tent to meet them, bowed to the ground, and he said, "My Lord, if I have found favor with you, please do not go on past your servant. Let a little water be brought, that you may wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. I will bring a bit of bread so that you may strengthen yourselves, and this is why you have passed your servant's way. Later you can continue on." And yes, they replied, "Do as you have said." So Abraham hurried into the tent and said to Sarah, "Quick, knead 3 measures of fine flour and make bread." And Abraham ran to the herd and got a tender, choice calf. He gave it to a young man who hurried to prepare it. Then Abraham took curds and milk, as well as the calf that he had prepared, and he set them before the men. He served them as he ate under the tree. A meal of peace. What an interesting story here in the life of Abraham. What a unique episode for this man in his journey of faith. We see Abraham here now as an old man, sitting by this tree, and 3 strangers start coming towards him. And right away he notices the Lord is in their midst. Now, whether or not the Lord is one of the 3 and the 2 angels are with him, this is what seems to be suggested in chapter 19, the 2 angels then that go on down to Sodom, or whether those 3 are in some way a representation of God. Some saints throughout history have even come to see the Trinity being foreshadowed in these events. We see Abraham in the midst of this strange visit, seeing these 3 creatures of angelic and divine origin before him. And he recognizes it's the Lord. He calls the one Adonai, Lord, meeting God, not just my Lord like you would call any other human lord and dignitary. Abraham realizes that this encounter is something unique. I mean, what would you do if you're sitting at your dinner table and the Lord comes to stop by? I mean, would you be fearful? Would you be afraid for God to take a seat at the table with you? Would you make sure your kids are being well behaved and make sure that they're keeping their hands to themselves? Would you bring out some leftovers from the night before? Or would you go through the hard work of preparing a wonderful meal? And we see Abraham, the details in the text are unique. It says that he hurried into the tent. He says to Sarai, "Knead 3 measures of flour, make bread, get a tender choice calf, have someone go and make it." And in the midst of it, he makes a beautiful feast for him to enjoy as he watched these angels and the Lord dine at his table. In the ancient world, to dine at a table with someone meant that there was relationship, that there was some prior reason why they were here together, that in some way in the past they had been united in such a manner that to sit at the table said, we are at peace with each other. For God to sit at the table with Abraham was a demonstration to Abraham that they were in a covenant relationship. In fact, this is what we have seen happen in the chapters prior, that God has ratified this covenant with Abraham. that Abraham has taken the seal of circumcision, as we see in the chapter prior, that he is in right standing with God, that every aspect of who Abraham is belongs to God and is God's responsibility. And in the midst of that now, they find themselves at a dinner table. Peace with God is what this image is portraying. That in the midst of waiting for the promised child, for Isaac, that in the midst of Abraham waiting with his wife to see how God would come through with making him the father of many nations. That's what his name has just been changed to, Abraham. That in the midst of it, God first demonstrates to Abraham, you and I are at peace. This meal that we celebrate together demonstrates a right relationship, a covenant fellowship with each other. You know, throughout the whole of Scripture, we see this metaphor pop up time and time again of what it means to be at peace with someone and to enjoy a meal. And oftentimes, what would once be considered warring and antithetical and adversarial relationships are mended and brought together at the table where peace is offered. I think of the story in the New Testament in Luke's gospel, in Luke chapter 19, where Jesus visits Zacchaeus. You remember Zacchaeus, right? Oh, Zacchaeus was a wee little man. You remember the song. I won't sing it for you, okay? Sing it at home on your couch with your friends right now. But here, Jesus with Zacchaeus sees this man, this chief tax collector, someone that had been abusing his power, someone that had been using his rights in order to diminish his own kindred around them. And Jesus comes to Zacchaeus, and what does he say? You know, come on down and hurry, because today it is necessary for me to stay at your house. What? You remember the reply of those around Zacchaeus. You know, Jesus, you're going to go hang out at the house of this sinful man? This man who has used his power to abuse? Zacchaeus said there, and he said, Lord, you know, remember, I'll give everything away. I'll give it to the poor. I'll help them all and all these things. And Jesus says to him this amazing truth in verse 9. Today, salvation has come to this house, Jesus said to him, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. That Zacchaeus, thousands of years later, as well enjoys fellowship at the table with Jesus, demonstrating that he is at peace with God. That in the midst of the journey of faith, times in your life and in my life where we so easily wander off, we are reminded to return to the table, to once again find peace, communion, and right relationship with God. You know, we're in the midst of a season right now of much anxiety and fear. And some of you, this is pulling out of your own life reminders of ways in which you are in an adversarial relationship with God. And what better time to slow down and to think of this metaphor and this theme of a table and ask yourself, God, are we right with each other? Lord, have I trusted in your Son? And Lord, have I continued to work out my salvation in fear and trembling? And Lord, can I dine with you in covenant relationship because I'm at peace with you? Are you at peace with God today? Are you like Zacchaeus, this man that God calls and says salvation can be in your household? It starts with being invited around the table. You know, the Lord's Supper as well is a reminder to us, and I look forward to the next time we could celebrate it together in person. That every time we take of the cup and eat of the bread together, we are declaring that God has reconciled us, that Jesus has paid the penalty for our sin, that we are in relationship and peace with God around the table. And you know, the scriptures also point to a time to come, a time for you and for me that we look forward to down the road. It's a banquet. It's a feast where God will invite all people to peace with him around the table through his Son, Jesus Christ. Once again, in Luke's gospel, in Luke chapter 14, we see that great imagery of this banquet to come. And Jesus talks about in this parable how he's invited people to come, and people keep using excuses. I have some financial matters I must take care of. I have marriage vows. I have all these other things that have gone on. Jesus, I don't have time to be at peace with you around your table. And so Jesus, read in Luke 14:15 in that area and following, he says to them, go out to the highways and byways and find the lame, the blind, the crippled, the poor, those that are seemingly on the outskirts of the acceptables, those who are forgotten and those who are placed to the side. Jesus says, bring them all to this banquet. Bring them all to this table. You and I, through faith in Jesus, are welcomed at this table. And we look forward to a time to come when we will sit and eat with him together at the marriage supper of the Lamb, at this great banquet to come. Peace at the table. And Abram, as he welcomed the Lord and as he cooked a feast before him, he observed what it means to have intimacy and fellowship with God. And it's based on this intimacy and fellowship that Abraham can trust God to come through for his promise. It's based on this peace, this bond, this covenant loyalty between God and now Abraham, that he knows by faith he will come through no matter how difficult it seems for his promise to come true and to fruition. For Abram, he was waiting for a son. For you and I, what are we waiting for? What are we hoping for in this way? I want to challenge you in two ways this morning. I want you to think of applying this idea of peace at the table in two ways. The first is, I want you to think about it in your relationship with God. Do you know God like this? Do you have peace with God through Jesus Christ? You know, there's one of my favorite portraits that's ever been done by Andrei Rublev. It's the Trinity. And you see in this picture this image of Abram welcoming these three beings, whether they're all angels or whether they're all supposed to represent God in some way. But you see at this image, in this beautiful picture, in this painting from the 15th century, that the three sit at this table, and at the front of the table, it looks as if there's an open spot. It's as if the artist is trying to say, come, take a seat. Come, dine with us. For the follower of God through Jesus Christ, this is the invitation to come, to take a seat, to see what it means to have peace with God. Do you have that peace today? Do you, in the midst of whatever fear you are going through, whatever uncertainty you feel, do you have peace with God? There's only one way, through his Son, Jesus Christ. If you trust him, you have peace. But secondly, I want you to think of applying it as well with those around us. Have you ever been at a table or a party or an event where you're sitting there and you know some people sitting there don't get along with people that are on the other side of the table? In fact, you could even see it when seating starts. People start to gather and they think, I'll sit here as long as I'm far away from so-and-so over there. I know you all know an awkward situation like that. And perhaps you'd have to be that person sometimes who's sandwiched between individuals, whether in your family or coworkers at a dinner party or whatever it might be, that you know can't stand to be in presence with each other. This metaphor of a table of peace, is also a challenge for you and I in the midst of moments like this to look around us to those that are closest to us and ask, am I at peace with them? Am I reconciled with them? If I am with God, I need to be with them as well. You know, the unique thing about this virus and this pandemic is that it's forcing us to not leave the table and the circle of those that are closest to us. And the challenge is that oftentimes, those are the exact individuals that get on our nerves the most. I'm talking, not from personal experience, of course, Here's an opportunity for you and I. Perhaps God is slowing us down at this moment to remind us what it means to find peace at the table. I'm praying over these coming weeks for our marriages. Those of us that are forced to sit at the table with those that perhaps we're struggling with to love. That you and I, in the midst of this time, might be strengthened with our wife and our children and our husbands and our relatives and those that are closest to us. That we might see in this example of Abraham, a man who could dine with the divine because he was in relationship. And out of that, we could welcome people to sit with us as well. How might we be like Abraham, generous in welcoming people to sit with us? People to sit with us. Now, I read a story recently. It was a true one. It was a story of a woman on the West Coast. She was a college professor, but she grew up in a Midwestern town during the Depression. And her dad was a hardworking man that was able through the course of his life to ultimately become a banker after the Depression ended. And he did pretty well for himself. And this man had 5 daughters, God bless him. And over time, all these women, they had grown up together and loved each other, and they were sisters together, but they had all grown and moved to different parts of the country. And this professor on the West Coast was the only one that lived far away. Years later, her dad died. And she came back to be with and to love her mom and to be with her sisters. And when she got to the dinner table that first night, she realized something going on in that house. Everything in the house had a tag on it. Mom had decided to sell the house now that her husband had passed on, and so the other sisters had made sure they got in there right away, and they put yellow tags on all the things that they wanted. So there was things that were marked for Judy and for Margaret and for Anne and for Susan, and everything in the house was coded accordingly. And this other woman, when she came back with her husband and saw it all, she felt sadness. That in the moments in her dad's death, the first thought was, what can we get? And so they were sitting at dinner. And the mom is sitting there in the corner with her shoulders slumped. And this woman from the West Coast, this professor, her husband stands up. And he takes out one tag. And he says, there is one thing and one thing only we want. We want to take Mom. And they put this tag on Mom, signifying to the others that he did not care for material things. What he wanted most was relationship with those that were closest to him. I pray in your life that God is using this moment to help you value the things that are truly important, the things that truly matter. Are you at peace with God and with each other? But lastly, in the text, we see that there's more. That not only is there a meal of peace, but that God says a message of power to Sarah in the midst of this. Look with me at verse 9. It says, "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he answered. And the Lord said, "I will certainly come back to you in about a year's time, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent behind him. Abraham and Sarah were old and getting on in years, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. So she laughed to herself. You see the laughter? "After am I worn out, will my Lord, when I am old, have my delight?" But the Lord asked Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, 'Can I really have a baby when I'm old?' Is anything impossible for the Lord?" That's the key verse in this section. Is anything impossible for the Lord? "At the appointed time, I will come back to you, and in about a year, she will have a son." Sarah denied it. "I did not laugh," she said, because she was afraid. But he replied, "No, you did laugh." Laughter. A message of power. Abraham and Sarah are old. The text says that she will not have this delight, that she is beyond the age of childbearing. And in that moment, when the Lord says to her, "You will have a son," she laughs. I mean, can you believe it? God comes to her. God dines with her husband. God dines right at her very house and tent and place where she lives. And God promises to come through with that which he has said he will from years in the past. "I will be faithful." And Sarah gives the Lord a side chuckle like, really? I mean, God, can you do that? Have you ever been skeptical in believing the Lord like this? Have you ever struggled to have faith? Have you ever, if you're honest this morning, similarly laughed at God, not believing he could come through? I know all of us have had moments like this. Perhaps you're in a moment like that right now, where you're thinking of the financial burdens that are on you, when you're thinking of the physical uncertainty and health before you, and you're asking, "God, can you really come through?" And it's in the midst of this skepticism, it's in the midst of this laughter from Sarah, that God delights in showing up. It says in the text that, "Is anything impossible for the Lord?" Verse 14. He asked her a question. "Sarah, is anything impossible for the Lord? Is anything impossible for me? Am I overcome by the fact that you're just a little old? Am I overcome by the fact that this has been a long time coming? Am I, God, not able and strong enough to be faithful to my word? Am I weak like this?" The text reminds us that God does marvelous things, that God is able to do miraculous things, that God majors in doing things that would blow our mind if we thought otherwise. And he looks at Sarah and he asks her a question that he asks you and that he asks me this morning. Is anything impossible for God? Is God overwhelmed by this pandemic right now? Is God unable to use this in ways in our life to bring us closer to peace with him and others? Is God overcome by this? Does God not have answers to mend those broken relationships? Is God not strong enough to bring healing where he wants to and where he wills? He is able. He is strong. And I love how the text says it in the next part of the verse 14. "At the appointed time, I will come back to you. In about a year, you will have a son." Interesting. An appointed time. In the eyes of God, Isaac's birth is a scheduled event. In the eyes of God, the birth of this miracle child is a scheduled event. It's not something that he has yet to put on his calendar. It's something that has already been booked and made certain to occur. It has just not yet come to fruition. And God says to Sarah, trust me. Nothing is too impossible for me. It's a message of hope. And I believe Sarah got this message. You turn on later in chapter 21, verse 6, and you see the name given. She says in verse 6, Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears will laugh with me. Why? Because that's what Isaac's name means. He laughs. Sarah demonstrating the laughter and the joy that God showed towards her. That God, in the midst of her cynical and skepticism, laughed towards him, brings true joy, brings true happiness. And this child, Isaac, was a sign that God sees and that God cares and that God is able to bring healing and power where it needs to be. No situation is too far gone. No burden is too great for God. No uncertainty we're facing as a church and as an island and as a nation together is overcoming in God's economy. In fact, God has an appointed time already out there for him to show his power and his wonderful divine laughter. Will we have eyes to see it? Will we be patient for it? Will we long for it? And the most amazing way that God brings about renewal is when he changes our life like this. When God turns hearts of stone to hearts of belief and trust in him. Will you trust him in a special way during this challenging and unique time? We don't know what the next coming days and months ahead are going to mean for us. But we know that the one who is in charge of all things is not overcome by it. Don't laugh at God. Find the joy and the laughter that comes in believing that he will come through. God is marvelous, and nothing is too great for him. I want you to do something. I want you this morning to write out what I'm calling in my life the impossible list. The impossible list of things that in my human mind, in my eyes of this earth, that as I look at it, there is no way it could happen. Maybe it's a person. Maybe it's a relationship that's broken. Maybe it's a financial burden. Maybe it's a fear during this time of this pandemic. Perhaps it's something else that's going on in your life that has you worried, and it seems impossible for there to be an answer. Write it down and start praying the prayer of Genesis 18:14. God, is anything too impossible for you? Let's believe together and trust by faith what God does in impossible situations to point people to him. There was as well another birth that was impossible in human eyes. That Mary, this virgin young girl, God came to her and she was pregnant. And she gave birth in an amazing way, an unbelievable way, to the Son of God. That God still was in the business of bringing life and laughter and hope in a seemingly impossible situation. And in Jesus, we see this ultimate fulfillment of the seed of Abraham, one who would come, who would offer peace to all people. You are invited to peace with God through this Son, Jesus Christ. Do you trust him? Nothing is too marvelous for him. Believe him today and find him faithful.